Hi there, whole community. Today we are graced with the presence of Miss Joi, Madison. I am so excited, but before we jump right into it, I would love for you to introduce yourself and talk about your expertise and what your focus is.
Okay, so I'm Joi K, Madison. I am an associate marriage and family therapist, and I'm a doctoral student. I'm in my 4th year.
Woohoo!
So I'm officially in dissertation phase.
That's amazing.
Kicking my butt. I am certified trauma-focused CBT, so I do a lot of work. My primary population that I work with is African American. I also do coaching. I call it clarity coaching because I love this idea of supporting people. My specialty is fear. My signature program is called the F Word, and it's all about how to approach, manage, and overcome your fears.
I love it.
Yeah, so we look at existential fears, like fear of rejection and meaning and all these different things. And then I also love working with couples.
We had an amazing, insightful conversation yesterday.
Yes, we did.
And I loved how you defined trauma. And I would love for you to give me, the clinical definition of trauma, and then how you've developed your understanding around trauma.
Yeah, so trauma is essentially when people are faced with circumstances that overwhelm or overcome their capacity to deal with them. So certain stressors could be emotional, could be financial, could be physical, could be, you name it.
Yeah.
But it's when you're faced with a set of circumstances that overcome or overwhelm your capacity to navigate or handle or cope with whatever it is you're faced with, right? And so that's sort of the blanket clinical definition.
Yeah.
And then for me, the more I understand it, I like to look at it through 4 lenses, right? How trauma affects your brain, how it affects your body, how it affects your beliefs, and then how it affects your behaviors. Because when you understand trauma from those perspectives, you get a very full picture of what is actually happening to a person who has survived trauma. It's also important to note that the word trauma can speak about the event itself that happened, or the effects of that event that the person is experiencing, right? So the word trauma can be used in both ways to talk about the event or the effects of the event. And when you look at the brain, the body, the behaviors, and the beliefs, you really get a full spectrum picture of how this event or circumstance really impacted and influenced and now informs the way this person shows up in the world. Quick neuroscience lesson. I'm not going to go super deep.
I love it. I'm here. I'm looking for it.
So essentially what happens is there's several areas of the brain, right? And each area has different responsibilities. And so we have what people sometimes call the reptilian brain, right? Which is the lower part of the center of our brain. And that is where we when we're scanning the area to see sort of where we are and categorizing people and things. Yeah. That is where we compute, I'll say, our emotions. And so if something comes up, you've heard of fight or flight, right? The fight or flight response. And so there's fight, flight, and freeze is actually the third option in that. And so what happens is we'll scan our environment, we'll look around, and something will happen and we'll have to make a very, very quick, usually subconscious assessment of whether or not this thing or this scenario is dangerous to us, right? And once we determine that it is, we go through the fight, flight, or freeze. But what also happens in the brain is that the portion of the brain that is processing that information, that is triggered. And the front part of your brain, the frontal lobe part of your brain, where we store memories, where we process, where we make rational decisions, that whole process, executive function, is shut down. It is not even working. So that's why people say you can't blame them for their reactions in certain moments and instances. And it's also why a lot of times when you talk to somebody who's lived through trauma, they can't remember a lot of the details. Or you can ask them about the incident several times and they may have several different versions because different parts of the story will be available to them in terms of their surface or their conscious memory at different times, right? And so it's hard because if we're talking from a legal perspective, somebody has lived through a trauma and every time maybe they're interrogated about it, they may give a different version of the story and it could look like they're lying. Because it's well, last time you said this, you said it happened at this time. And it's really those details are so jumbled in my brain because the part of my brain that would have been processing that information coming in wasn't even alert at the time. It was all about that reptilian brain, which is just about survival. at that point.
I'm going to ask this question only out of pure curiosity.
Sure.
But does it ever happen that the memories get jumbled by being confronted with it as well? Like, say, for instance, you remember the incident, but now you have to testify in court, or you have to retell the event or anything like that. And that event is so traumatic that now incites like kind of like a blurred, like recounts of the
Absolutely.
event.
That's called re-traumatization. And this is why, when I'm going back now to like the therapeutic perspective, when a part of treating trauma, one intervention is like storytelling. We call it a trauma narrative, where we allow the person, the survivor, to write their narrative out, which helps them the process of a couple of things. One, externalizing the event, right? Because a lot of times people who live through trauma internalize it and assume some sort of shame or blame for what happened. So it helps to externalize the event so that they don't carry it as part of who they are and therefore part of something that's bad or wrong about them. The other part that it does is it helps them approach the event and desensitize. Because remember, I talked about reliving those feelings and emotions over and over again is exhausting and sometimes can lead to other issues. And so getting control over the narrative by telling it over and over again helps to expose you to those emotions in a controlled environment, because you're doing that in therapy, right? In a controlled environment that allows you to move through the process of the emotions as they come out, but you're also safe and protected, right? But when we're doing that as therapists, we are also very first giving coping mechanisms and self-regulation skills and mindfulness techniques and breathing, and we're completely giving them control to say, hey, if it gets too bad, stop, we can pause. So I'm saying that to say what you're asking is absolutely, if somebody's on the stand and they're having to recount the details of something that happened that was traumatizing for them, it can absolutely be re-traumatizing just to tell the story.
Right.
Absolutely. So again, that front part of your brain, the frontal lobe, is shut down and you're functioning strictly from that sort of reptilian brain.
Yeah.
And it's all about survival. So what's happening is your heart rate's going up, your blood pressure's going up, your pupils are dilating so you can see better if it's nighttime, whatever.
Right.
And so all those things are physiological responses, hence the reason why trauma lives in your body, because those responses tend to be what are the most prevalent and available in the forefront of your mind when you think back to the moment, mostly because if you're thinking about the event, you're more than likely putting yourself back in the fight or flight mode. And so your body needs to be prepared to fight or run.
Yeah.
And so this is why the traumatic event tends to live in the body, because again, the part of your brain where memories are stored, where you would remember the details, that part is shut down, but your body is fully active and ready to do whatever it has to do to survive. So that's why the trauma tends to live in the body.
Can we go backtrack, because you use the term trauma responses, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've recently learned about all the language around trauma and how we can really identify certain things. So you mentioned trauma responses. How else can we kind of like become reactive, kind of like to the trauma that we've experienced? Or something like that?
So remember, I was saying it's the brain, the body, the beliefs, and behaviors, right? And so trauma responses are cognitive in your thoughts.
Okay.
Right? So again, it's about like this internal dialogue of like, someone's always out to get you, after you, you're ascribing negative intentions to people's behaviors. So it's, if I accidentally step on your foot, it's like, you meant to do that, you're trying to do that to me, you become like aggressive. So there's that, and that starts with your thought process, right? Like, if someone steps on your foot and you go automatically into the story that they meant to do it because they're out to do you harm, that's a cognitive response to a trauma that you've likely survived that makes you feel like you have to be kind of on guard all the time. Exactly. So, and it shows up in our emotions, where some people can be overly emotional. Other times people can be detached from their emotions, right? And they can go numb. Because, as I said, trauma lives in your body. And so for people who, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that, but for people who have lived through trauma, and because it lives in their body, what will happen is they're constantly being triggered by their environment. And that can be overwhelming and exhausting to constantly feel like everything is a trigger, everything is out to get you, everything is a threat. So what happens is they'll learn, it's like a learned behavior to like disassociate from those emotions and to try to shut them down, which is why a lot of times people who have lived through trauma tend to turn towards substance abuse, because it's a way to escape the feeling of constantly feeling like threatened or in danger. So when you're talking about externalizing it, doing that trauma narrative helps, because the way that we layer it is, the first layer is you just talk about the facts. Where were you? What happened? When did it happen? Who was there? Just the facts.
Yeah.
And then you layer in, the second time you go through the narrative, you start to layer in your feelings and your thoughts. Right? And so by doing it that way, it first kind of creates the scenario where the event is just the event. Right? It's just a thing that happened.
Right.
It's just part of the story. Then you start to layer in your emotions and thoughts, which helps you understand this was my response to the thing that happened. The thing that happened is not a part of me. Right? And so when you begin to go through that process, it helps, because now when you're sitting in a safe room with a therapist and you're equipped with all your skills and your breathing and your mindfulness and all of that, you're not necessarily going to be in that same hypervigilant kind of space emotionally and psychologically. And so now you have the capacity to look at the event with much more logic and rationale than you did as it was occurring.
Yeah.
So now you're looking at it and you're telling a story about what happened versus living in it and feeling like this is me. And because, again, it lives in your body, it's easy to then internalize it as, in fact, a part of you.
That's so good.
Yeah.
And then the third part?
And then the behaviors, right? And so that or the beliefs we talked about.
Yeah.
And so the beliefs, again, are tied to this idea that you start to believe the world is a dangerous place, that people are out to get you, that people's intentions are negative or malicious. And then that begins to be sort of how you see the world. And then, of course, once you view the world as negative and unsafe and threatening, that becomes hard to form relationships. You go into places and you find that maybe you like always check for where the exit is, or you know, all kinds of, there's things I don't sit with my back to the door, or there's all kinds of like rules that you begin to create around trying to protect yourself from this dangerous, threatening world. And when that's your come from or your perspective every time, that's going to influence every choice you make. Every choice you make. There are some people who have lived through traumas that, you know, touch is a trigger.
Right.
You know? And so you're meeting someone, they're trying to shake your hand or your hug or whatever, and that's a trigger for you. And who knows how you respond, because if that puts you in fight or flight, do you want to fight somebody?
Yeah.
Are you running out of a business conference because someone tried to shake your hand? Like, now you're having inappropriate responses in situations because the beliefs underlying the scenario tend to lean towards negative, even if they're just neutral, right? Like, it's really hard for people who have survived trauma to not look at everything and assess for whether or not it's going to be a bad situation for them.
It's so deep.
I know. And when the more I learn about it, the more I'm just like, and we don't have a clue how many people we're passing by on the street who are living with some form of trauma, and we may take their response to us as some kind of and it's like you know what, agenda. That's not even about you. I have my own set of stuff going on. Like, the more I learn about it, the more I'm just like, this is heavy. And people are walking around with this load constantly.
What are some of the beliefs that you've heard along your way that like really like was astounding to you, that this is something that is really true to somebody that has survived trauma or experienced trauma?
So I'm thinking specifically of a young lady who survived sex trafficking, human trafficking. And she was, I think, 11 or 12 when she was kidnapped, essentially, and went into this world very young, right? Of course, her sense of self still very much developing. And then, you know, when you get to your teen years, that's really when you're, you know, stepping into an understanding.
Right.
And during this time of her life, she was being sold for sex. And so by the time she was 13 or 14 years old, it sort of became like, this is my life. This is it. Like, this is my life. This is who I am. This is all I'm good enough for. There was a period of time, according to her, when it was Even if I did get out of here, no one would love me. I'm damaged goods, so that became her story. So that when she did escape at 16 or 17 years old, that was all she knew, how to survive.
Yeah.
Just to use her body. And that was what she knew herself to be good for. So anybody showing interest, she assumed it was about sex, and that was like her only sort of tool in her toolbox.
Right.
And so because of that experience, and hers, years we're talking, years of her life, 6 or 7 years or something like that of her life, this was her identity. And when she came out, it was really hard for her to accept that it didn't have to be. That she could choose a different story, a different life, that she could heal, that was a part of what had happened to her, but it doesn't have to be who she is. That was a really hard concept for her to grasp, because if we're talking at the time that I saw her, I think she might have been 20 or 21. So 6 or 7 years of her life, we're talking about like a third of her life, was that, and so
like, what else is there?
What else is there? Who else am I? What do you mean there's more? What do you mean people care about me outside of this? I don't understand that. So that was heartbreaking, actually.
It's just horrific to even think of, like circumstances like that existing, like that humans would do that to other humans. But it's like, in that whole thing, like how was she able to heal from it? What kind of work did you do with her so that she can start having different beliefs? Yeah,
so good question. So the thing about healing is that it's an ongoing process, right? Like, even if and when a person is able to change their minds, you're still living in the world, and there will still be triggers, and there will still be things that will cause you to flash back and remember, or sometimes even re-experience difficult things.
Right, of course.
So when you ask the question of how was she able to heal, I think what we were able to do in the time that I worked with her, which was really only about 6 months, is not a lot of time at all when you consider 6 years of her life was that. And all the stories that were developed, the beliefs that were developed as a result of that experience and that period of her life. But in the 6 months that we worked together, we of course went through the trauma narrative. I also taught her some rhythmic things because, again, since it lives in your body, it's important to work through the body, because just talking with trauma isn't going to be enough, because, again, the part of your brain where you process all that wasn't functioning. So there's going to be things that you won't be able to access unless you go into the body and do that work, that somatic work. So we did a little bit of that. And she was certainly able to externalize. She was able to get feel safe around men, which was not at all possible.
Really?
Not without her feeling like it was going to end in sex. Right?
Wow.
So she could be like at a restaurant, and if a guy sat at the table next to her, she would be thinking like, eventually he's going to take me and we're going to have sex.
Wow.
So she was able to get to a place where she would still be triggered.
Yeah.
But she understood the trigger and was able to have a different internal narrative that she could regulate herself and not have that hypervigilant kind of response where the heart rate is up and all those things. And that was sort of the most we were able to do. I haven't seen her in a while, so I can't follow up and say like where she is today.
Of course.
But that was, considering the amount of time, some really relevant work that we did, and that she was able to achieve a level of safety and comfort within her own body that had been stolen from her for years. Yeah.
that kind of like takes me back to like this idea of loyalty to your trauma. And I don't know if it's separate as far as like the beliefs that we tell ourselves or that was created, or if it's the fact that, you know, you feel guilty, kind of like survivor's remorse. Like you weren't supposed to make it or you weren't worthy, which is a part of the beliefs. But I want to hear or learn a little bit more about even that.
Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit of that survivor's remorse, which can be very common in like veterans.
Yeah.
Right. Who come back from war and their fellow soldiers like didn't make it.
Yeah.
Right. And they feel like it's not fair. Also people who just come from rough neighborhoods. Right. Whose friends didn't make it out and maybe they did and maybe they got to go to college or whatever else. And then they have the survivor's remorse. It can also be if the trauma happens at the hands of someone that you know and love and trust. Right, which is often the case. Particularly if we're talking about like people who are sexually violated, it's often by someone they know. Yeah. And so there can be this sense of like loyalty to that person despite what they've done to you because there may be a family member, right? Right. And so there's that confusion. Yeah. And also those types of violations, sexual violations, often come with a lot of psychological manipulation first. Of course. Where they tell you that it's love and I really care about you and don't tell anyone this is our little secret. So it can get a little bit warped.
Where they want to kind of like involve you in the process so you feel guilty. Yeah. That it's like, well, it was my fault. I went with it. Yeah. Or you think, no, we're really in love. This is really a relationship. This person really cares about me. And it's like, no, they're taking advantage of you and using you, making sure that you won't tell on them. And so, but you're convinced that you're really in love with this person and that they're in love with you and that maybe you're going to run away one day and everybody else just doesn't understand that this is true love or whatever. So there's that. And there's also sometimes, like the woman I just spoke to you about, where she came to know herself in the context of that trauma. So the experience became a part of her identity because that's how she knew herself. Yeah. And so part of the work we did was disassociating from this idea that changing her mind was a betrayal, like a self-betrayal. Wow. Right, because this is who I am. And I came to develop this narrative that I'm strong because I can choose to engage sexually, right, and do this thing, and it becomes like this kind of like warped, empowered feeling. Yeah. Because this is what our minds are capable of when we're in survival mode, and we have to again tell these stories so just to make it through. You know, just to make it through the next day or the next round of men or whatever her circumstances were. She came to develop this story that it was like she was empowered and look how these men would, you know, fall to their knees for her and they want her and she was this and that. And so that became like this story about she was like this like sex warrior, right? Wow. Kind of a thing. Yeah. And so like to change that was like betraying in her mind this caricature that she had created about who she is. Right. And so realizing like you can still have an empowered narrative that doesn't have to be attached to this trauma. Right. And so in that way, people can be loyal to it as well because they don't know themselves in any other context. Right. I don't know myself outside of being the violent person or the victim or the da-da-da. So this or the person that came from a rough neighborhood and never made it out. Or so like I play it out and this is like who I am. Yeah. And so I have to stay loyal to this story because if I change this, what else has to change? It's like domino effect. Right? That is like everything has to change. And if I'm not this person in the world, then what does that mean about how I've defined the world and other people in it? And everything has to change and I have to dismantle all of that. And it's just easier for me to stick with what it's been, even if I know it doesn't serve me. There seems to be, especially in our society today, the need for validation in an unhealthy way.
Oh, you know, like codependence?
Correct. Okay. And there's like these trauma bonds that kind of form out of it. You know, like, can you describe like what trauma bonds mean and like how that can kind of like play out in today's life? Yeah. And how do we recognize that if we're in that? Oof.
You know? How much time we got? Codependence is a huge indicator of some level of trauma. Codependence meaning like typically the most common, I think, and probably the most relatable or identifiable situation would be like if someone is involved in like substance abuse and then their partner, right, will basically engage them, right? Like maybe not necessarily buy them the drugs, but will continue to keep the environment such that they can buy their own drugs, essentially.
Yeah.
Like, so you're sort of complicit in that you're not explicitly, either cutting them off or putting them in a situation, rehab or whatever, where they get the support that they need. But instead, you're kind of like caught up in this cycle with them. And a large part of that is you feeling like a lot of times a person who ends up in a relationship with someone, an intimate partnership with someone who has a substance abuse issue is because they need to feel needed, right? So when this person is on their drugs and they're doing their thing, like you feel like now your role in life is to cater to and be the hero and save them and fix them up and all those things. And so that gives the person a sense of like purpose and meaning in their lives because they understand themselves in that role as a caretaker kind of a deal. Does that make sense? And
Makes
so that,
sense,
so you find or create scenarios where you get to be the hero. And so the trauma bonds often happen where there's a person who loves to be the victim and there's a person who loves to be the hero, and they get together and create situations where each person gets to be the thing. No, but they don't really like it.
Right.
Like I don't want to keep having to save you from this, but I'm not going to get out of it because on some level I need to keep saving you from this because that's how I know myself. That's how I find value in myself, when I can fix it, when I can heal it, when I can save you, when I, you know what I mean? Like that's how I prove my own worth in this world, is that I'm able to love you hard enough to pull you out of this thing, this addiction that you have, or this habit, or this pattern. There's also trauma bonds where people sort of connect on the idea of having survived a trauma, right?
Yes.
So, I'm trying to think. I had a couple that I was seeing. The young woman grew up in a home where dad was abusive, emotionally abusive, and then the male partner, he grew up in a home where he was sexually abused by his stepfather.
Oh my God.
And so when they became close and shared those intimate details about their lives with each other, that became like the place at which they were like drawn to each other. Like this, you understand me, I don't have to feel ashamed of my trauma with you, which on some level, on the surface, seems healthy, which is why it can be like a little bit of a convoluted situation. Because on the surface, it's, you understand me and I don't have to hide and I can be authentic and da-da-da-da-da. Sure. But when that is all you have, and then when you're not talking about that, you can't get along, you can't make it work, there's nothing else in common, you have no shared values, but it's this magnetism that comes from that part of me, like the part of me that I don't believe I can share this with anyone else. And so because you've accepted this part, I'll put up with the other stuff. Yeah. Right? And so they would come in and it was like, I would see them. And when we were talking about the trauma, they would be like comforting each other and the rubbing of the legs and I'm sorry and I'm here for you and the tears and tissue. But then it would be like something outside of their trauma that we talk about. Like they're just in their relationship and they were just like firecracker. Like they could not get along. So it was like that was the only thing they had in common that was keeping them together. The fact that they had both lived through some traumatic experiences as children. Yeah. And outside of that, they had nothing in common and could not seem to break away from that. And so what I shared with them, just quite candidly, I said to them, as you begin to heal yourselves as it relates to your individual traumas that you've experienced, the likelihood that this relationship will last is very, very small.
Wow, that was pretty straightforward.
I had to say that because they were coming in, because I always tell people when I work with couples, your relationship is my client. not you individually, your relationship.
Yep.
So I'm here to work with you with regard to the relationship. So when I see that this relationship is rooted in trauma and you're both here to heal that, when that heals, just know, not that it's impossible,
right,
but know that the relationship that you're coming back to will not be the one that you entered in originally. You'll be starting over.
Right. Does it also mean the fact that if trauma is the only anchor for a relationship, that people will tend to sabotage each other's growth because they got so comfortable with who your broken self are? We're broken, two broken people just living together. So like, don't you dare change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what will often happen is, again, I think that relationships are the greatest opportunity we have to see ourselves.
Yes.
Right?
Agreed.
Like somebody's reflecting back to you a version of you that you don't see without them being there.
Agreed.
Right? And so if they grow and change and you were attracted by your trauma and they grow and change, that means that there's the capacity to grow and change. That can happen. That's possible. We don't have to stay rooted in and defined by our traumas. But if you change and I choose not to do that work, and you're reflecting me back to me, then that means I have to see I'm choosing to stay here. I'm choosing to stay broken. I'm choosing to stay and live in this pain. If you grow and I don't, I have to then look at myself and say, why am I not choosing to grow and heal and change? And a lot of people don't want to do that. And so this is why we begin to get into relationships where I need you to be somebody to validate my story about who I am. Right? And so
I want to like understand, right? Like, what is that thing where you have to accept, like, okay, I am different. I disassociate from the identity that was created. And what are the steps that you really have to take or look at first to rebuild your life and like this new identity or identify with new healthier habits?
Yeah, it's a long process. It's a long process.
Right.
What I like to do, and this is across the board, regardless of what I'm dealing with, is I like to start with what we call psychoeducation, which is teaching people about whatever the issue is. So in this case with trauma, I teach them about what happened in their brain.
I love that.
When this happened. And, and so if we talk about, they developed, it's my fault. I shouldn't have gone over. I shouldn't have worn the thing. whatever. And so we talk about, these things where you're blaming yourself and this and that, this is what's happening. And so I help them sort of fill in the blanks by explaining what actually happened with them when the thing went down. Right?
That's so good.
And that helps a lot because then people start to feel like, okay, I'm not crazy.
Right.
Because it's oftentimes you can start to feel crazy.
Absolutely.
And the other thing that I do is I talk about different ways in which trauma can like show up. Like we talk about like individual trauma. We'll talk about like group trauma, talk about mass trauma, talk about historical trauma, and just view it through different lenses because what it helps people do is understand they're not alone.
Yeah.
Which especially when people go through individual traumas, they can feel isolated.
Absolutely.
So you're not alone. Trauma happens all kinds of ways and millions of people have lived through it and survived it and can overcome it. And this is what that process looks like. So a lot of early education and then, like I said, going through the trauma narrative and then incorporating some of the rhythmic movement and sound stuff to get that body piece in. Also empowering them by teaching them how to self-regulate because the truth is we all live with triggers.
Can you describe self-regulation?
So self-regulation, again, that fight or flight response is going to be triggered. The heart rate's going up, the blood pressure's going up. These things are happening. So an easy one to access is deep breathing. So it's 4 seconds in, you breathe in, exhale. And you hold for 4 seconds. Just hold your breath. And then release for 4 seconds slowly. And what that does is it brings your attention to your breathing. And when you're breathing that slowly, the rest of your body's systems begin to also regulate themselves. Right? Because again, when your heart rate is up and you're hyperventilating, you're
right.
So when you are very intentional about slowing that down, the rest of your body's systems can also slow down. The heart rate goes down. You start to also recognize that where you are may not necessarily be a dangerous place. So another one is what happens too with spiraling thoughts is that if you're triggered and you think the thing is dangerous, the situation is dangerous, the person is a threat, you start creating all these stories. They're going to do this, they're going to do that. And it's like the girl, I would tell you, she would sit down and she would think, eventually he's going to attack me and he's going to take me off somewhere and we're going to end up having sex, right? He's going to rape me because this is how the story goes that quickly. He just sits right down and she's going, right? And so, the other thing that I would have her do is it's a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise where you identify 5 things in the room that you can see. Mm-hmm. And then you also identify 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and then 1 thing you can taste. Because what that does is, again, it slows you down, but it brings you back to the present moment. Yeah. Because the mind tends to go right into, he's going to take me somewhere else and then he's going to drag me in the back. So you're somewhere, you're still sitting at your table in the restaurant, but your mind is somewhere in an alley where he's taking you and drag you to rape you. Right? So when you bring yourself back by doing the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, identifying things in the room that you can see, smell, hear, taste, and touch, then that regulates you. You realize you're in a safe space. You're not being threatened. You can come back sort of to this present moment reality. Yeah. Which, again, when your mind starts to wander and go crazy, it can spiral very, very quickly into a dangerous place. So those are some things. There's also something called, you essentially squeeze, tighten, progressive relaxation, where you tighten your body and then you release it. Because again, when you're in that hypervigilant state, you find yourself sort of tightened all the time, ready to go at all times. Right. And so if you exist like this, and it becomes your new normal. You don't even realize that you're carrying stress, that you're constantly gripping the steering wheel. You don't realize it. So when you do the progressive relaxation, what it does is it gives you that internal sensory sort of feeling of the difference between being tense and being relaxed. And when you do that intentionally, when you find yourself tense, you'll be more readily able to identify that and tell yourself, well, I can relax. Yeah. So it's really about the biggest part of therapy when you're talking about treating someone who's lived through trauma is creating a safe space. Literally before I do any interventions or education, say that you're safe. You can say anything. There's no judgment here. I will make sure you're protected. Creating space for them to know, I can lower these defenses. Yeah.
I just love that you kind of encapsulates how trauma affects us in every part of it. Yeah. How do we identify it within ourselves though? If you, you mentioned that it's either the event or the experience, right? Sure. And sometimes the experience gets a little murky. Somebody might ask, what happened to you that you think that you are suffering from trauma or dealing with PTSD? But is there something that we can kind of utilize as a benchmark within ourselves to really be able to take care of ourselves by recognizing it?
Sure, that's a great question. I also want to note that it's important that we understand there are negative events that can happen that don't have to be classified as trauma. And we can have trauma that will not necessarily lead to a clinically diagnosable trauma-related disorder. Yeah. Right? Like you mentioned PTSD. People can live through trauma and not necessarily develop PTSD. Right. And it doesn't mean that whatever symptoms and signs that they may be displaying or presenting are less important, right? Because they don't necessarily have that diagnosable disorder, right? So it's important to note that, because you're asking the question, especially as the topic of mental health grows and people become more familiar with the language and comfortable using it. Sometimes it gets misused. Yeah. It just kind of goes with the territory. So when you're asking the question of how do we identify it in ourselves, if you can remember a time before the trauma happened, and you can remember how you were and who you were before that, and you're noticing changes in the way you behave or interact with people after a traumatic event, that's a good sign that maybe the trauma has impacted you in some kind of way, and it's deeper than, whenever it just happened in that moment, but is actually living with you. For a lot of people, though, who may have experienced a trauma at a young age, they may not have the luxury of remembering themselves prior to the event. And so I would say, thinking about if you find yourself hyper aware or hyper vigilant or sort of assessing areas and assuming threat most of the time, that's probably a trauma response. Because what happens after trauma, and I'm sure we'll get more into it later, but what happens after trauma is that typically in an event, when it happens, you feel powerless and you feel helpless, right? Because again, the definition of it is that whatever is going on is overcoming or overwhelming your ability to process and ability to cope and manage and your capacity to navigate the situation. And so when you find yourself in those situations, or you find yourself having survived a situation like that, afterwards you tend to be easily triggered, because anything can be a reminder or reminiscent of the time when you were left powerless in a situation. So you tend to judge everything through the lens of like trying to hurt you or being a threat to you, right? And so if you find yourself like hyper vigilant all the time, you might want to think about, or if you're aware of a trauma that you've lived through, you might want to go back and trace some of those hyper vigilant ways of showing up in the world back to that and see if they're connected. Likely they are.
We talked about when you have the language to describe what you feel and what you're going through, it helps you kind of face the monster. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So people who live through traumatic events often will develop a disorder called alexithymia, which is essentially where they lose the ability to identify and name their emotions. Like they don't have the words. So what will happen is, one of the things I look for is that if I ask them how they felt, they will often respond with like what they would do, because they don't have the language to say. So like, for instance, I would say like, what would you do? How would you feel right now if a bear just crashed through the door? And if you said, I would run. But how would you feel? They don't know. They don't have access to the language to say, I would be afraid. Right? So that's a key sort of sign for me if I'm able to ask a feeling question or an emotion question and a person isn't able to answer and they answer with an action, then it's like, okay, you may have lost that language. And we know that language is very, very powerful. It's limiting, but it's powerful. Particularly if you have a story within you that you need to externalize and get out, so that it's not a part of who you are, but something that you survived and lived through, a thing that happened to you, right? If you don't have the language to do that process of externalizing, then you, in some cases, are disempowered, right? And so doing things like introducing the language of emotions, doing things like moving in rhythms instead, doing things like, what color would you choose that would match up with how you felt in that moment? Right? Like, so giving them other ways to communicate the feeling that may not have to be language, right? Spoken word language, I should say, because there's language in movement. There's language in all kinds of other ways. And so noticing up front, because again, if a person has lived through trauma and they felt powerless, the last thing you want to do is put them in a room where they don't have the language to explain that and keep asking them to do it. And then they feel inadequate and powerless in that moment too. And you're just, continues. So if you notice that they don't have the capacity to do that, be creative, invite other ways, dance it out, draw it out. I mean, I'm serious. This is real, right? This is very real. We've all seen movement that has brought us to tears because we can see the power and the emotion in the story, right? And so that is available to people. Drumming is a very huge new intervention that's coming around. It's not new. Obviously, we know ancient drumming. Years Africa, but in terms of its use clinically. It's new, and that's an emerging way that people are working through trauma, creating rhythms and getting that somatic piece and that energy to move and do that. So there's ways to access those emotions and then beginning to develop language around it such that when they are ready and the time is right, they will have access to the words to say, I was afraid, I was, whatever, I felt powerless, I felt hopeless, I felt helpless, I felt violated, whatever the things that they may be able to say. There's so many other ways to express that don't have to be limited by the language that a person may or may not have.
in circumstances where it's so overwhelming and we feel like there's almost nothing left to be hopeful for, like
Sure.
the feeling of feeling dead inside, you know, or suicidality. How can we better deal with that feeling in that moment?
When the person or
the person.
The person,
Let's
yeah.
start with the person.
Again, going in, I'm thinking from my therapist hat again, right? Like if I'm sitting in front of someone who says, I've lived through this, and though I've survived, like I'm physically sitting here, I feel dead inside, right? I think that I would reframe that by saying, one, that's okay, right? And that perhaps that part of you needs to die so that you can move on.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Right? And then what does it look like for you to come alive again? And maybe not as that same person, but in a new way. Yeah. How can you redefine who you are? How can you recreate new experiences? And how can you begin to make meaning for yourself from this day forward, right? And not necessarily having to go back to that or reclaim that or do anything with it. Maybe if that's what works for you to say that part of me, that version of me is no longer, that's okay.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, when we're talking about healing, again, with it, not only is it an ongoing process, it's a very personal and intimate process, right? And so if that's what you need to feel whole again, who am I to tell you that that's not the way to do it? Like, my perspective as a professional is that I'm a professional, but you're the expert. You're the expert on you.
Yeah.
You are the expert on your experiences and your dreams and your fears and your hopes. Like that's all you. So I come with tools and resources and ideas and interventions to support your process. And so if you tell me in order to move forward from this, I need to kill that part of me or that version of me, we can have a full ceremony and lay that person to rest and we can move on. Yeah. Like if that's what you want to do, I am so with it. As long as it's not, dangerous. Right. And so when you talk about suicidality, I think same process. I think, so I get it, right? Someone says they want to kill themselves and our first reaction is to be like, no. And that's really our own death anxieties coming up. Yeah. That's our stuff. And so the work of being empathetic is getting out of your stuff and accepting someone else's without it, not adopting it as your own, but accepting it as theirs and not trying to force it to look like yours. So because you have some death anxiety, someone else says, no, I'm ready to be out of here. You're like, no. And it's like, hey, you know what? Right. I know some of your story. You've shared with me. Thank you for trusting me with that. And I can understand based on what you shared, how it might feel like dying is your best or only option. Right? And be with them in that space of like, I get it. It's hard. You're scared. There's pain. All these different things that make you feel like dying is probably better. And then that gives them a second to really kind of sit with that notion. And the other thing that I like to do is ask, is it that you want to die? Or is it that you want to escape the pain or the fear or the thing? Right. Because if it's that you want to escape that, there are other ways to escape it without having to die. Yeah. Then, because a lot of times for people, suicide feels like the last option. Yeah. Right? Like it's my best or only option. Like this is it. There's no other. And because the circumstances are so big, the event is so big, their responses and how it lives in their body and their minds are so big, it can be blinding. So that's all they see. So as a person that they trust enough to share this story with, because the truth is, a person who's really going to go through with suicide, they're not going to tell you. Right. They're just going to do it. Right. Which is why when we hear the stories, we're like, no one knew. We had no idea. Because people who are really going to do it. Or the process that it took for them to get to that. Yes, right? they're out of here. Right. But the people who speak about it, they're subconsciously, they're looking for a way out. They're looking for someone to say that doesn't have to be. But the way you say it can change everything. Yeah. if you validate and say, I understand why that feels like an option for you, then it's like, I'm seen.
Yeah.
I'm accepted. I belong. I'm heard. I matter.
I matter.
Those are the things that people who don't want to be here or who feel like suicide is their those are the things they want to hear. So when you validate those feelings of not wanting to be here, sounds like counterintuitive, but when you say, I understand why dying feels like your best option, they go, oh, you get me. You see me.
Yeah.
And that instantly is what every human being is looking for, to be seen and to be accepted. And when you do that, immediately a lot of the weight that makes them feel like death is the best option is lifted. And then they're able to open up their minds and eyes to see that there are, in fact, other ways to navigate this.
And if you are a person that, we talked about how we self-regulate and how we can deal with trauma within ourselves and how to even identify it and find ways to work through it. But how do you identify it in somebody else? How do you realize and recognize that somebody might need help?
Sure. Yeah, so some of the things we talked about earlier, that hypervigilance, like if you notice that somebody is kind of like extra paranoid and they jump around a lot, or they're always asking a bunch of questions, who's going to be there, what time is it, where, like they want to know all the details, that is an indicator that they're trying to control the situation. And a desire to control, again, comes from that feeling of being out of control.
Yeah.
Right? When the thing happened to you, so you want to have your grips on as much of the information and details as you possibly can to try to manipulate it to make sure that you don't find yourself in a position where you're being taken advantage of or damaged or hurt in some kind of way again. So when you have friends who are maybe like asking a million questions and who's going to be there and what time and how is this and all of that, it's like, okay, what is going on? And again, being mindful, because it's so easy to get annoyed by that.
Right.
If you're not thinking, most people are not thinking with a clinician brain. Right. Going like, these are signs and symptoms. Like they're not doing that, right? Like most people are just like, we just want to go out. Why are you asking all these questions, right? And then it feels like I'm attacked. You know what? Never mind. I'm not going to go because I can't be in control of it. And then y'all don't really get it. And I don't. So you know what? I'm gonna chill at home. Right? And so when someone is sort of asking those kinds of questions, always trying to be in control of the situation, always sort of head on the swivel, where are we, what's going on? It might just kind of like raise an eyebrow a little bit like, Yeah. And then you think of them. If you know this person, you know something that happened to them that they may not have even connected to. Yeah. The fact that they are showing up in these sort of hyper aware, borderline paranoid kinds of ways. The reactiveness. Yeah, they shared a story with you about something that happened. They were in a house fire and now they don't like to be, don't lock the door or, things like that. They may not even recognize. Absolutely. So, just being, if you find the person shows up and they're kind of hyper aware, always looking around, questions trying to control, might just be a clue that like maybe there's some underlying trauma there and they're like trying to work out how to stay safe in a situation. Yeah. How do we help, to your point, if a loved one is experiencing either a panic attack or have overcome, trauma and is suffering? How can we be there for them? Safe space. Yeah. And that's kind of what I meant. Validate. Like how can we be a safe space for them? Validate. Yeah. Right. Because, and what I mean by validate is when their emotions come up or when they have the hypervigilant response to the situation, don't shame them. Cause can you imagine like you're with someone and then all of a sudden they're triggered and they just like run screaming cause something scared them and you don't understand what happened. And but now you're embarrassed. And so you're like, what's wrong with you? Why would you do? And then you're shaming them, right? You don't even realize it. So, what I mean by creating a safe space is validate them, right? And when they have feelings or memories or they're triggered, create space for their process. Remind them that they're safe, right? and say, it's okay, I understand, because they're going to intermittently remember different details about the event because, again, that part of their brain was shut down. Something could trigger and remember, oh my God, that was the sound the clock made right before I got hit in the head. And that sound triggers, and then all of a sudden they're going into that. Create space for that process. Say, it's okay, I understand. Not necessarily that because I understand and have lived through what you've lived through, but because I understand that you've lived through it, that is going to be a process for you to overcome it. And I want to make sure that when you're in my presence, you know that process, it doesn't have to be rushed. It doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be on my timeline. Any of that.
Right.
This is about you being whole again.
That's so good. And like, what do you say to people that always assume that people should be over it, especially with traumatic people describing or wanting to share that they're struggling or suffering?
That's a really, really tough one. The get over it is like, I can't even. That's such a tough question because you can, again, like I was saying earlier, you can never know what people have lived through. Yeah. You can never know. And you can never know the loss that it caused them, the pain that it causes them. Like, you can never know. So the get over it is just, that is just incredibly tough for me to hear. And if the question is, what do I say to the people who would suggest that someone who has lived through trauma just get over it? I would say, do yourself and them a favor. Just don't be in their life. Like, if you can't be empathetic enough.
That, right?
Yeah, if you can't be empathetic enough to understand, I'm not saying that you have to journey with them every step of the way. I'm not saying that you're not entitled to your own response to how they're whatever. What I am saying though is that if you can't honor this person enough to say, hey, maybe I don't understand, but I love you enough to trust your process. Like, if you can't do that, then just walk away, bow out gracefully, and allow them to have their process without the pressure of you judging them for whatever that process looks like. Like, that's really all I can say about that.
No, that's true. Yeah. That's true. So good. So good. Well, Joi, I feel like we have to have several series. I'm going to go back to LA and we're going to do several more.
I would love that.
But like, you were so insightful, and I have learned so much just like in a conversation with you, you know, that I feel like there's so much more that I can put language to and have tools to kind of like understand. Because as you said, we sometimes don't even know, because we mentioned normalizing trauma. We sometimes don't even know that we're dealing with stuff.
Sure.
And hearing you just describe that we really just have to stay vigilant, the word of the day, in knowing and understanding ourselves and being aware.
Sure.
And, finding tools, finding therapists, finding experts to kind of like help guide us through it.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, for creating this platform to inform and encourage all the people around mental wellness.
Right.
It's very, very important.
Thank you. And thank you for being a part of it.
Of course.
Well, whole community, hope you enjoyed that episode. And I think I can mention that you should have enjoyed that, because there was a lot of work that you need to go and do and grow in, because it is possible to kind of overcome our trauma and the hurt that we're going through, and we all are dealing with it. And so once we have these tools, we can be better, and we can actually feel like the world can be a brighter, happier place again. So have a good evening. Thank you for joining us. And this is Ms. Joi Madison. Please look her up.
Thank
tags
you.
are linked in the video.
Thank you so much.
Go to her talk. She's an amazing coach. And like, just teaches so many amazing things out there. So if you haven't heard from her, please look her up and follow her journey, because I'm sure she's going to blow up soon. But thank you so much once again for joining in. Visit our website at www.weheartourlives.com and sign up. Be a part of our community, and let's heal together. Thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you so much.
That was amazing. Seriously.
Yeah, that was good stuff. Good stuff.
Right?
That was a lot.